Well, we're on lesson 70, and we're going to be talking about the kings. This lesson is going to go pretty quick. It reminded me of being on a roller coaster ride. Have you been on a roller coaster? Especially one of those small ones? I used to ride on this roller coaster called the Wild Mouse in Okoboji, Iowa. And when I was a kid, when I got on there, I knew there was going to be some harsh turns and some quick dips. Hey? And that's the way this lesson's going to be. You're going to have some turns this way. This culture takes over. This culture takes over. This culture takes over. They're fighting here. They're reigning together. So there's going to be a lot of little quirks. So you need to put on your thinking caps, and I'm going to go through this whole lesson, and it's going to end with a big battle called the Battle of Hastings. So let's begin, okay? So the history of England. Remember, there were different peoples and cultures. And guess what they were doing, of course? They were all battling control for the whole island of England. We usually think when a conquering nation takes over that it will impose its ways on the conquered people, and their culture would reign. But that's not really the way it goes. It's not all that simple. In fact, many times when the conquering nation takes over the conquered nation, you know what? They settle in and take the cultures of the nation that's already been conquered. And you wonder why? Well, let me tell you, it has to do a lot with God. You wouldn't say that, but it does. You see, because we see in England, we see that many of those Anglo-Saxons coming in to fight against the Celtic people, and the Celtic people had heard the gospel. We know for sure because we know of St. Patrick in Ireland, and we also know of King Arthur and many others of the Celtic tribes that had become Christians. And so when the Anglo-Saxons, the Jutes, came in, they were evangelized, which meant they had heard the gospel. Even though they had taken over the culture there, they had started to become Christians because the good news was preached in England and Ireland. How cool is that? And then we know that those pagan pirate Vikings came in and they were attacking all these countries. And the very Anglo-Saxons that the Celtic people had evangelized, these very Anglo-Saxons that were just ruthless had become Christians, and we find kings like King Alfred. And King Alfred had led many of the Vikings, even the Viking kings, to Jesus. So as the Vikings came in with the Danish and the Norsemen, they had become Christians as they settled with the English. And then we have those Vikings that came into the northern France, and the same thing happened in northern France. We even see the Vikings settling in with the French and taking on the French culture and the French language. And even today, that Normandy, is part of France. Can you believe that? When it was totally controlled by the Vikings, the Viking pirates had settled in, and many had become Christians. Then we have the languages. Of course, the Old English language. Have you ever tried to read Old English? Sometimes you can get out an old Bible with the old King James and the thous and these, and it's kind of hard, isn't it? So even the Old English was even more drastic to learn than most other cultures. And so when we find the Dutch, or I should say the Danish culture coming in, and we find the Vikings coming in, they had short words instead of long words. And so their short words took over the culture, and suddenly the English and the language of Scandinavia came together. Can you believe that? And there were some words like, let's see, leg, your skin, your skull, the parts of your body. They were all Viking words. And now they were in the English dictionary. Well, I should say in the English language, as they didn't have a dictionary back then. Then the words like to drown or to get hungry or to be weak, those were Viking words. Can you believe that? And words like eggs, steaks, and dirt. It goes on and on. The English language was getting shorter and mixed with those Viking words. Can you believe that? Yes, they would also be a melting pot. What does a melting pot mean? As a lot of Danish people would marry, a lot of Viking Norsemen would marry in with the English culture and the French too, and suddenly you would find their heritage was very mixture. Their kids were a mixture of all those three, or four, I should say, cultures. Actually, five. You'd have the Brits, and you'd have the Celtic, and you'd have the Danish, and you'd have the Norsemen, and you'd have the Normans. Oh, and one more, you'd have the French. And they were all mixing together. Can you believe that? Then we find the next 900 to 1000 AD, those years would be a mixture, when we look at England, of the Anglo-Saxon versus the Norse and the Norman kings. They would all be fighting for control of England. And Normandy, of course, as I told before, was given to the Vikings by the French. So just remember that. So when you hear of Norse, they're the Northmen from Scandinavia. When you hear of Normandy, they're the South. And they were originally from Scandinavia too, but mainly Danish. And then in the middle we have the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes and Celts and Brits, and we have such a wonderful melting pot. Yes, this is going to get a little bit complicated. So let's get ready to go on a roller coaster ride. So hold on and put on your thinking caps. We're going to go through the kings of England. So we are going to start. Can you see this? I hope so. There we go. We are going to start. It's going to be called Who Wants to Be King of England? And we start, of course, with Alfred the Great and his son Edward. Of course, Alfred and Edward were very strong leaders and Christian leaders, in fact, and everybody loved them and trusted them. They were Anglo-Saxons. But now, what happened after they died? Let's find out what happened. So we have Athelstan. Well, who was Athelstan? He was the grandson of Alfred, and Alfred was that strong leader, and he defeated a band of raiders in 937 and protected England. Everything was fine and dandy until 939. After Athelstan died, there would be complete disorder of England. Disorder, okay. What kind of disorder? Well, we go from all the E-kings. A secret. Whenever you think of the word England, you think of E. I always think of those guys that start with the letter E because a lot of them had the same names. And so let's look at those names. Well, we had Edmund, Edred, Edwy, Edgar, Edward II. Times were chaotic at this time, and one leader would take over, and they all should have inherited, but some of them were brothers and some of them were sons. But as we get going, we have the ease of disorder. But then it would get even more drastic because we would have this guy, and I kind of highlighted the things in pink. His name was Ethelred II, and he was called the Unready. He would take evil advice. In fact, he murdered Edgar, one of the kings, and he opposed and abused the Danish. You see, the Danish were living in that land, and the Danish, as they lived in, they got along with him, but he did not. So he took everything away and abused the Danish people living in the land. So when you think of Ethelred, he was unready. He was not a good leader. It got worse because then the Danish people would get mad, of course, thinking, we need a leader. This is terrible. We're being persecuted. And so in would come this guy. This guy's name, it's a weird name. His name was Sweyn Forkbeard. The reason his name was Sweyn Forkbeard because he had a very bushy beard and he wore his beard in 2 braids. Have you ever seen that today? Guys wearing their beards in braids? I've seen it, but that definitely was a Viking thing back then, not English. And so Swen, he got upset, and so in 1013 he led an army and defeated um, uh, Ethelred the Unready. I'm sorry, my computer kind of got off. He defeated Ethelred the Unready, and he fled to Normandy. Can you believe that? So Ethelred is gone. Swen is king. And he is not even English. Can you believe that? He's not even English, and he's king. So as we go on here, let's go on. We have the next. We have Swen and Ethelred here, the second, and Ethelred, and they die the next year. Now, who would be king? Things are going to get pretty complicated. Both of them are dead. Now we have another dip to go through, another jerk to go by. Does my face look a little bit red there? Maybe it's because I'm talking about Ethelred, huh? So now we have Edmund Ironside, and he's Ethelred's son, and he's Anglo-Saxon, and he's fighting with Swen Forkbeard's son, and Swen Forkbeard's son, who is Danish, is named Canute. There's a much fighting on both sides, and both sides are in trouble because both sides they lose a lot of soldiers. So Canute, of course, Canute is not a E word, is it? So Canute is Swen's son, and he is Danish. And Canute has offered Edmund Ironside to share power because they've been fighting so much. So they become co-leaders. Never before has this ever happened when you have a Danish king, Canute, from the Viking origin, and Edmund, I should say, Ironside, and he's English, and they decide to reign together. That's a first, huh? And as we go, we find suddenly, of course, Edmund Ironside dies, and Canute is the first total Danish ruler since Swen Forkbeard, of course. And Canute now is king. All right. Whew. Things are getting even more complicated, but we got to get through this. Canute's sons now this is kind of weird because Canute marries Emma. And Emma is the ex-wife, I should say, because actually she's the widow of Ethelred. So he decides to marry her. So now we have Emma, and Emma has children with Canute. And so we have these children, Harold the Harefoot and Hardy Canute, really weird names, and they're Danish, but they are sons of Emma, who was married to Ethelred II. So this is very weird. But Emma also had 2 sons before this with Ethelred. And one of the sons was named Edward the Confessor, and he would be king. So now Emma is going to have 3 of her sons being king, and by marrying a Danish man, Canute, a Danish king, and she also was already married to Ethelred, who had died. Isn't that a story? That is crazy. So let's go. Edward III is the son of Ethelred. So we have, and his name is called Edward the Confessor because he would confess his weaknesses. He actually was a good king, and he was a Christian king. And he came to be king for 20 years. So that's quite a while for these kings to reign. So we're on this bend of everything seemed pretty normal for about 20 years. But then he died. And guess what? He had no children. And this was a big problem back then. So now what? Now what are we going to do? Who would be king? let's stop there and take a break, and then we're going to go on and find out who does become king.